Okay, we are on to chapter 9 of Dr. Chapman's book, The Five Love Languages, this chapter is about discovering your primary love language. So now that he's reviewed the five different love languages and given some examples, for some people, just hearing the examples makes it obvious which love language is their primary, but others may need some additional help or coaching to understand what their primary love language is. So as we seek to love and serve and help each other, I wanted to share a scripture from Matthew chapter 22. So this is a scenario where there was a lawyer who was trying to ask Christ a tricky question, and how he responded is instructive for all of us. The lawyer said, "Master, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So really looking at that second one, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, something that's easy to overlook is that we would prefer that people love and serve us in the way that is most important to us. In other words, we'd love if they understood us enough to serve us for who we uniquely are. And that's why understanding these five love languages in the marriage relationship is so important. I remember for me early on, before I learned this information, I tried to show my wife love by serving her, by doing lots of chores around the house, by doing lots of things to help and serve her, to show my love. And I got quite frustrated that it didn't seem to make any difference. And of course, when I learned later that her primary love language was quality time, that's when I discovered that me doing the chore with her was actually more beneficial to her than me doing the chore for her. That it was about the quality time spent together rather than how much work I got done. And it was both relieving and frustrating when I figured that out, because it was relieving because suddenly I realized that I didn't have to book it and do quite so many chores, but also frustrating to realize that patiently doing things together would have to be something that I needed to learn how to do better in order to help her. So in the chapter, Dr. Chapman gives several different ways that you can attempt to figure out what your primary love language is. For instance, he gives the examples of, well, imagine going without one of these five, going without words of affirmation or acts of service, and see if you imagine, well, if that one was taken away, how would I feel? And quite often it's the one that you would feel most strongly a lack if that wasn't happening. That would help you realize, oh, that's actually probably my primary love language. He also mentions specifically in terms of physical touch that it can be confusing. It would seem that many men's primary love language is physical touch, but that's not necessarily a valid assumption because of the strong biological component there. So it's important to remember that just because men are more biologically driven to seek intercourse is not an assumption that their primary love language is physical touch. So it's important to consider all five in all cases. So he also recommends, if you're still struggling to understand, consider what things hurt the most. Do critical words hurt the most? What sort of things, if you take the love language and you do the opposite of it, the negative of it, what hurts the most, what's most impactful? Also, what's most requested? Consider what are the things that you ask for or desire that your spouse would do for you most often. And again, as in the example I gave, what are you doing consistently for your spouse that you wish she was doing for you? Again, that for me was kind of a dead giveaway that for me, my primary love language is acts of service. Remember also to consider yourself and not just expectations, because remember, we all have expectations from the home we grew up in terms of what the man should do or what the woman should do and what these roles look like. So it's important when looking for primary love language to look beyond the should, beyond that, well, I'm supposed to, or this is how it's supposed to be, and say, well, what actually brings me joy, what actually makes me feel happier, or what, if there's a lack of, really disturbs me the most, and really consider the individual rather than just the expectations of the household they grew up in. Dr. Chapman points out that some people are legitimately bilingual. They have two different ways to fill their love tank. And so for their partners, it's all the easier because they can pick which one of those works best for them and kind of focus on that. And again, if you've gone through all these exercises he's proposing and you're still not quite sure what the primary love language might be, then consider back to the Twitter-pated phase, the courtship phase of your relationship. What things did you naturally do that maybe you're not doing now? What things did your spouse do that maybe they're not doing now? And consider what things you did naturally that felt natural during the courtship phase that maybe you don't do now. And consider maybe how some of those things may be clues to primary love languages of one or both of you. And finally, he gives the exercise to help each other to maybe discover this, but also once it's discovered to kind of lift things. He calls it the tank check game, where when you come home at the end of the day and you're together, you say, hey, where's your love tank at today? And it's 0 to 10, where 0 is completely empty and 10 is absolutely full. I'm feeling perfectly loved. And then find out where they're at. And then you ask, once you know where they're at, say they're at a 7, you say, what could I do to make that a 10 for you today? Or what could I do to fill that love tank? And the idea being of this game that you guys make simple requests of each other, requests that you think would help, and the other one does their best to fulfill that request that evening, and see how that goes and see how that strengthens the relationship. So that's an excellent chapter on discovering your primary love language with some practical tools to figure it out and start being able to fill each other's love tanks better. And again, the scripture references shared during this video are in the description.